Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Niels Dingemanse. He's Tenured Professor in Behavioural Ecology in the Department of Biology at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Germany. He conducts evolutionary behavioral ecology research, asking questions about the adaptive evolution of behavioral strategies and their genetic architectures within an ecological context. His research is motivated by behavioral ecology, life history, and quantitative genetics theory, and seeks to test predictions and assumptions of adaptive theory using observational and experimental approaches in the laboratory and the wild. So, Dr. Dingemanse, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Okay, great. So, today we're going to focus a lot on behavioral ecology, but let me first ask you this because I'm not sure how you should think about the relationship between behavioral ecology and evolutionary biology in general, let's say. So what's the relationship there? Because I was just thinking that maybe, when we think about evolution by natural selection, we think about evolved behaviors, a repertoire of behaviors, I guess. But then, in specific ecological contexts, it seems that animals deploy different strategies, correct?
Yeah, so the relationship between ecology and evolution is actually pretty clear. Traits evolve given the ecological conditions. So if you think, for example, about feeding specializations, in many populations you have organisms or animals that differ in their mouth parts, right? Yeah. And this is because the environment is offering different types of foods. And it's these ecological conditions that then cause, in this case, disruptive selection, allowing the maintenance of different feeding specializations within the same population. So thereby we really see that knowledge about the ecological conditions allows us to understand why traits evolve in a particular type of way. And in addition, you could argue that if we think about evolutionary biology as a whole, and particularly the part of evolutionary biology like quantitative genetics that's seeking to understand how the genetic architecture of traits is leading to evolution in combination with patterns of selection, those types of studies generally ask, given the structure that we have, the structure of behavioral traits, for example, the correlation structure, and given the selection pressures, how does evolution proceed? Whereas ecologists, or particularly behavior ecologists, ask, but why? Why are these traits correlated? Can we come up with a scenario by which we understand, given the costs and benefits of these behaviors and maybe constraints imposed on the system, why those traits are actually evolving in these particular ecological conditions?
Yeah, I understand. But when we talk about the behavioral repertoire of a given species, is that all evolved traits? Are they all, for example, adaptations or byproducts of adaptations, or is it that sometimes there's a bit of flexibility and there in specific ecological conditions, maybe they give rise to novel behaviors that are not really part of the evolved repertoire?
Yeah, so if we think about the evolved repertoire, right? These repertoires, they can come in different forms, right? We can imagine, for example, that we have genetically determined behavioral strategies, for example, right? So hawks and doves, right? For example, that have some genetic underpinning because there's genes coding for how aggressive you are or how you are responding in an agonistic interaction.
Yeah.
And those differences can, of course, evolve by means of natural selection. In this case, frequency-dependent selection, negative frequency-dependent selection might maintain this variation. But these evolved differences can also come about by means of evolved variation in phenotypic plasticity. So it might be profitable for an individual to change its behavior depending on the ecological conditions. So for example, if you are faced with a hawk, maybe you want to switch your behavior and become a dove, right? And those are both aspects of what I would call like the evolved behavioral repertoire, right? Sort of the average differences between individuals that might be of genetic origin, but also their ability to plastically adjust to phenotypic, to changes in environmental conditions. And often it's thought that this ability to be phenotypically plastic has evolved within the ecological conditions that the population has been experiencing. But when you put this population in a novel ecological circumstance, these norms of reaction would still act, and that is going to produce the novel phenotypes. And that is where selection then can then greatly act and help, you could say, the population to adapt to these new circumstances. So particularly these novel circumstances are super interesting because the organisms will probably respond to the novel circumstances by means of phenotypic plasticity. But there will often be a large amount of variation expressed within that population because selection hasn't eroded any of it. And that then produces the raw material on which selection can then act in this novel environmental condition. And the idea is often that it's phenotypic plasticity that allows this population initially to change towards the adaptive optima. And then we see patterns that are called like a genetic accommodation, for example, that then leads to the evolution of these fixed phenotypes that we started with.
And this phenotypic plasticity, does it vary between species? I mean, are there species that have more behavioral plasticity than others? And does it depend on the kinds of environments they've evolved in? I mean, for example, if a particular environment shifts more or is more variable than another one, do the species that evolved in the environment that is more variable have more behavioral plasticity than the others?
Yeah, that is the idea. There are also lots of experimental studies that try to address this idea by, for example, asking questions about where the phenotypic plasticity is evolving in conditions and force on the population, right? Either conditions being stable or conditions being highly variable.
Yeah.
But the idea is that phenotypic plasticity has benefits, but of course, only in situations where the environment is changing. In a stable environment, there are no benefits of being plastic, right? But it might also have costs, actually, right? So you need, say, a sensory system, and you need a neurological setup, right, of your brain that allows you to process this information. And then you also need to be able to change your phenotype quickly enough, right? So imagine that you are a stickleback fish and there's a predator coming into the population. Now it's better to have larger spines. Well, these spines that take time to grow, right? So whether then there is phenotypic plasticity, whether that evolves, will actually then depend on how quickly the organism is capable of also changing the phenotype, right? And so there are benefits of plasticity, there are costs of plasticity too, in terms of that you need to set up a system that allows you to, to get this information, right, to be able to take decisions. Uh, and there are limits to plasticity as well. And therefore, plasticity is thought to not always evolve. So often we think, right, like it's super, of course, right, if you're flexible in your behavior, this is good, right? No, it's not always good, right? That is only good when the benefits are outweighing the costs. And there's quite a bit of work, actually, trying to sort of test these obvious hypotheses, right? It's obvious prediction. And it's not so clear cut actually. It's very hard to show these costs of plasticity actually. But there is some work, particularly natural populations, that is asking. That is addressing this from a different type of perspective and asking, well, do we actually see that there is selection on plasticity, right? So we require, of course, variation, genetic variation in phenotypic plasticity for it to be able to evolve, right? So imagine that everyone is unplastic, right? Everyone is like a sturdy phenotype that doesn't change. There can be very strong selection. It might be very good to be plastic, but if we're incapable of doing that, it's not going to happen until we have mutations, for example, that suddenly create animals that are phenotypically plastic, right? And so one major goal, right, in evolutionary biology has always been to also quantify variation, right? Because variation is the raw material on which selection can act. And in the context of phenotypic plasticity, people have been quantifying actually at length whether individuals, but certainly genotypes, whether they differ in their phenotypic capacity to change. And so there are quite a few studies in natural populations also that have done this, and they found that plasticity is heritable. It means that some individuals basically have the genetic disposition to be plastic and more than others. And there have also been studies that have asked, is there then selection on phenotypic plasticity? And you can imagine this, for example, very well in the context of climate change, right? That with the change in the climate, there are different sets of selection pressures acting on how you should respond to a change in temperature. And the optimal level of phenotypic plasticity that individuals should show has probably changed. And there are some studies, particularly in passerine birds, right, where people have been studying nest box populations, large populations of nest boxes for 60 or even 80 years, a nice longitudinal data sets where we are able to then show that phenotypic plasticity indeed can evolve by means of natural selection.
That is very interesting. So, can climate change provide us with a sort of natural laboratory to put these predictions and hypotheses to test? I mean, because I was just thinking that. I mean, you said that there are people that have been studying a particular animal or species for 70 or 80 years. Is that enough? Is that time frame enough for us to really notice some changes? I mean, in terms of their phenotype or even at the level of genetic evolution?
Yeah, there is a lot of debate about this question, but also particularly in the context of understanding whether phenotypic plasticity can evolve. And one of the sort of daunting conclusions actually has been that we might often need to pool data from many different populations to be able to get a good insight or accurate estimates of whether there is actually changing patterns of selection on phenotypic plasticity. And the reason for that is that phenotypes are also changing for all kinds of other reasons, right? Over generations, there is, for example, genetic drift as well. So this task is not very easy, but for sure, right? If we want to work out whether over time there are changes in population structures due to natural selection, we need actually longitudinal population studies, and there are relatively few of those, right? The system that we're living in, right, the scientific environment, if you look at the funding system, people certainly working at universities that have to apply for a new grant every 3 years,
Mhm.
they find it very hard to keep up these longitudinal studies, right? So even though we think that would be very good, right, to have these types of studies, because they would allow us to very firmly address these questions about how traits are evolving over, say a couple of decades or something like that, and potentially in response to climate change or other changes in the environment.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, they require these types of studies that are around, but maybe there are too few of them actually,
Mhm.
given how our funding is actually coming about.
Yeah. So let's talk now specifically about animal personality. So when we talk about animal personality, what are the aspects of behavioral or psychological traits of animals that fall under the rubric of personality?
Well, this question we can actually answer in two ways,
Mhm.
and I will give you first the behavior ecology answer actually, because
Yeah.
there's also the personality psychologist type of answer. Okay,
Mhm.
so behavior ecologists have long been interested in understanding adaptive behavior. So understanding what is the right behavior to show at in this particular context, right? And so you can
Right.
think, for example, about optimal foraging behavior. How much prey should a parent collect before it goes back to the nest, right? And there
Mhm.
are models that provide us with quantitative predictions. If your nest is located this far and you see a decline in your ability to find prey of this particular type of form, etc., then we can predict exactly what you should do. That's a behavior ecologist type of paradigm, right? Under particular types of uh, assumptions, of course, right? And
Mhm.
so what has been interesting is that over the past 2 decades or so, um, people have become interested in the notion that not everyone is actually the same, right? And so that if you actually do repeated observations of the same behavior across a set of individuals, say under standardized conditions, they're not all doing the same thing. So if you think about this foraging behavior, for example, maybe the average animal is doing exactly what we're predicting, right?
Mhm.
It comes back with like 4 or 5 prey, right, in this particular ecological condition. But then if you look at all the animals, right, you see that there's a lot of variation. And previously, people were always thinking, well, there's just noise around the adaptive mean. That was always that noise, right? Well, there is some, measurement error, or yeah, there is just some variation that selection hasn't eroded, right? There's mutation selection balance, right? The idea that mutations bring in genetic variation, and then selection needs to erode it, right? And of course, there is a balance between these two, right? And therefore, there might be some variation, but that's just sort of noise, right? It was one of the ideas. But what we've seen over the past 2 decades or so is that for many behavioral traits, individuals are actually repeatable. And now there is a whole suite of theoretical models, again, like behavior ecologists like to come up with adaptive theory with quantitative predictions about what animals should do under which conditions. And there are models that actually predict under which conditions we get the evolution of like these repeatable differences in behavior. And as far as we are concerned, this whole idea could be applied to any type of behavior. It could be foraging behavior, it could be parental care, it could be aggressiveness. We talked about the hawks and the doves, for example. So that's the behavior ecologist view, right?
Uh-huh.
The observation that not everyone is the same for a given behavioral trait, and why that might be the case, that is what interests behavior ecologists working on personality. Okay, that was the first answer. Yeah. Now,
Yeah. And
the second
now let's talk about personality psychology, right?
yes, yeah. The second answer um, is more informed by you could say the practice in psychology, right? Personality psychologists, they have developed these really cool tools, right, to understand in what aspects of behavior people differ.
Yeah.
And I think all of us are aware of the big five personality traits, right? I always tend to forget them. There's conscientiousness, introversion, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, and openness to new experiences, right? There's the big five personality traits. And the idea is that these are axes of variation on which people differ, right? So the independent, orthogonal, you could say, axis of variation on which every individual could be classified. And I think a very interesting observation is that personality psychologists, by and large, right, there is debate about this, have found this structure in very different types of cultures. And these assessments of personality, they are based on questionnaires, right? So they have to do with the vocabulary that's available in a particular type of language, right? And therefore, it's also debated whether you would actually find the same structure. But by and large, it seems to be the case, right? So we have these big five personality axes. Now, to come back to animal behaviorists. So there is also a class of people working in animal behavior that has asked, are animals in this respect similar to people? Do we also find these big five personality axes? And one approach, and that has been particularly been applied to primates, right, to big apes and also to monkeys, is that we have human observers that are observing animals, and typically we have multiple observers, right, that observe all the same animals independently, and then they score these animals on these big five personality traits, right? And then they say, yeah, I think this is an extroverted animal or an introverted animal, for example, right? So you can score these animals on all kinds of aspects, and then you can again do this type of analysis and ask whether this structure is the same as we see in human behavior. Now, the problem is, of course, that we're not even sure, right, that these are not just observer effects, right, and that we have some sort of subjective bias in the behavior that these animals are showing, right? Maybe that's all in our heads, right? And there have been approaches developed to actually address these types of issues. So you can look, for example, at the correlation between all these behaviors across the observers and control for that, and then look at the structure of behavior, right? So that is one way, and many of the people working in animal behavior ecology, find this approach really at odds with with the way that we study behavior, because we tend not to start with an observed observed phenomenon and ask, like, so what sort of variation do we actually see in this species? We tend to start with a question, right? We say we're predicting that this works in this way. Let's see if that's the case, right? So there's been a lot of resistance actually within behavior ecology. Behavior ecologists generally try not to actually apply this approach, and there have been calls for also not applying such types of approaches, because it doesn't actually help us to address these adaptive questions. But what we see in practice is that people working on personality in animals, they're using the types of tests that map certainly on some of these axes, right? So, for example, a very common test is a so-called novel environment test, or an open field test, where an individual is basically captured and then released in a novel environment. And often this is a laboratory room, right? So completely novel. And in the context of a bird, for example, you would put trees, right? Artificial trees in the room, and you could look at how it hops around. I've also worked on sticklebacks. So sticklebacks you would put in a little aquarium with big stones, for example, so that it obstructs the environment, and you could look at how it then explores it. And these types of behavioral assays, they are very much aligned, you could say, with like this axis of introversion, extroversion, right, or novelty seeking that we see in humans. So there are these standardized tests that we are using that we think might be relatively similar, measuring similar types of behaviors that personality psychologists might be using. But I should say, as a behavior ecologist, we typically, you could say, don't care about that so much. We are actually conducting these types of essays because we have some adaptive predictions about how ecological conditions should shape this variation. But there are
Right.
really these two areas, and in the literature, many readers are not very clear about this. So there might be you could say, a formal theoretical model that predicts when personality in this particular type of behavior evolves. People might read that and say, this is really cool. And there might be next to it a study that applies a personality psychologist view to characterize a variation. And then readers just don't see how these two things connect. And they
Yeah.
don't, right, in many ways, because they ask different questions. They come from completely different directions. And that has led to a lot of confusion and debates.
Mhm. Yeah. So I was just thinking about studies done in humans from disciplines like behavioral genetics, because I mean, isn't it also important for us to try to understand to what extent personality traits are influenced by genetics and to what extent they are a result of the environmental conditions a particular individual is exposed to?
Yeah, there is a lot of work on the genetics of personality, both actually in behavior ecology and in personality psychology. And in personality psychology, this was also at the forefront, right? In the 60s and 70s, for example, where people were using these full and half zip designs or twin studies to estimate how much of this variation was due to genetics, right? Using twins that were raised apart, right? So that common environmental conditions could not actually lead to bias in the estimates of heritability. And those studies have been applied to actually large sets of data, showing that about half of the variation, or a bit less, but something like 50%, right, of the variation in our personality is of genetic origin. What is very interesting is that we have done these types of studies too, of course, right? Because animals are super suitable. We can just actually determine ourselves who will mate with whom, right? And thereby we can create this variation in genetic relatedness by simply imposing a half full zip design on the population for a number of generations and so by now, right, there have been many estimates of heritability of behavior for these behaviors measured in the context of personality, maybe many more actually as personality estimates in humans. I don't know that exactly. But what we are finding are much lower levels of heritability, typically 10 or maybe 20%. And there is an interesting, there's an actually interesting explanation for that. And this is because personality psychologists are very much interested in characterizing the variation in personality. So the paradigm would be to design assays that allow us to estimate an individual's average behavior. Okay,
Right.
so imagine that across the questionnaire, you might not always give the same type of answer, right? To the sort of the same type of question, right? So you could ask, do you like to be alone? And then you could also ask, would you like to go to a party, right? So the different ways of checking, asking the same question and looking at whether you give the same answer. And so what the personality psychologists would do over all the data and essays, they would calculate a mean behavior. And that purges all the plasticity, right? That's actually in the data, what we call plasticity, right? The fact that you might change your behavior depending on the condition, as we know very well from animals, right? We just talked about that, this idea of that plasticity can be adaptive and evolving. So the personality psychologist would by and large, right, estimate an individual's mean behavior, so that's its personality, and then they would ask, is that heritable? If you take away most of the variation in behavior, because the repeatability of behavior is about 40%, so 60%, over half, is due to phenotypic plasticity or maybe a little bit of measurement error, but we don't think that's very important. So if you take that away, then of course your estimate of heritability is artificially inflated. So to say this differently, the heritability of personality might be about 50%, and that's also what we see in animals. Actually, the heritability of your average behavior over many repeated observations, but the heritability of the behavior is half of that or less. And the question is, of course, what does selection act on? Does it act on the behavior that you express at this point in time now, or does it actually act on your average behavior? Because you should ask, why are we actually interested in estimating heritability? Is this because we're interested in the genetics? Probably not, right? We're actually interested, at least as an evolutionary ecologist or evolutionary biologist, in understanding how this variation could evolve.
Yeah. When we say that, a particular personality trait has an heritability of 50%, does that mean that those 50% are all based on genetic factors, or could there be other factors there that are influencing this heritability?
Well, if inheritability would be 50%, right? That's an estimate, right? That comes from a particular study design. And often there are a number of assumptions that we would have to make.
Yeah.
And we can also estimate different types of heritabilities. What we're often doing, the common approach would be that you mate, for example, one female with multiple males, or one male with multiple females, and therefore you're producing full and half SIPs.
Yeah.
And therefore there is variation in genetic relatedness among everyone. And then what we're basically doing is we are looking at whether the difference in genetic relatedness is predicting the difference in the phenotypes that we see among all the individuals. So there's no magic there, right? This is the quantitative genetics approach. And from that, we can then estimate, based on certain assumptions, how much of that variation is due to additive effect of genes. There are also other approaches that allow you to look at non-additive genetic effects of genes. But in all these cases, there are certain assumptions that we have to make. And this really depends on the study design. So for example, there could also be maternal effects, right? That there are environmental effects that are caused by a variation among mothers, right? So if you think about animals, right, some mothers might produce more milk than others, or different quality milk, or provide different amounts of parental care, right? And therefore,
would those be epigenetic effects?
yeah, they could be, right? But my point is, like, if you have an estimate of 50%, right, it really depends on the study design, whether this is an accurate representation of the amount of genetic variance, right? So there could easily be all kinds of biases caused by environmental effects. And in practice, right, the experiments that we are doing, they don't allow us to control for everything. And to bring this one step further, there are also what are called indirect genetic effects. So, for example, imagine that the amount of milk that you get from your mother is affecting your growth, and therefore maybe how aggressive you are in adulthood. Right? This is an environmental effect in principle, right? So you would say that's not part of the heritable effect. But the female might have genes that affect how much milk she's producing. And those genes might actually then cause what's called an indirect genetic effect. They might even be correlated. So animals that are aggressive might actually, as mothers, produce more milk, right? Genotypes. And this then means that our calculation of the amount of genetic variance needs to change if we have these what are called social environmental effects, indirect effects. So this is not so clear cut, actually. But with the correct experimental design, given the assumption that we make, we interpret the estimates as they are, right?
Yeah. Do we know if those kinds of gene environment correlations that we know happen in humans, like the active ones, the passive ones, the reactive ones, could also occur in other animals? I mean, for example, could the behavior of a mother be in any way influenced by the behavior of the infant in other animals?
Yeah, I think it's often the other way around, that it's the behavior of the mother influencing the behavior of the offspring, because the offspring is more open to be affected by environmental effects. And those are those, say, maternal effects, right? And they could act either via the genes, right? There could simply be a genetic correlation there between between the effect that the female has an environmental effect on the offspring, or it could act via how she is behaving, right? So parents, for example, train their offspring in many ways, right? I work on birds, on grey tits. After the eggs hatch, right, they are in the nest for about 20 days. Then the offspring fledge, but they're not independent. The parents go with them for 2 or 3 weeks, and they teach them all kinds of things, essentially, right? So, for example, if a predator comes by, then the parents make a certain call, and the offspring respond to that. And in that sense, you can imagine that if you have a very shy parent that really quickly would like to retract when it's in a risky situation, it will teach the offspring to be like that too. And this would then create also resemblance between parents and offspring. And if you do a quantitative genetics analysis, you would actually find that the trait is heritable.
Yeah.
But it's not due to the genes in this case. It's due to the behavioral effect that the parent has on the offspring. And there are actually some studies that show these effects. There's some work on zebra finches where the parents have been scored, the offspring have been scored, but the offspring have been raised by other parents, by foster parents, right?
Yeah.
And what they're actually finding is that the behavior of the offspring, in terms of some of these personality traits, is actually resembling the behavior of the foster parents, right? So if you wouldn't have swapped them, you would actually have found these types of effects of what's called non-genetic inheritance.
Yeah, very interesting. So another question would be, not what, are personality traits adaptations? I mean, perhaps we could get here into the question of what is an adaptation, because that is still a debate going on in evolutionary biology, right? But can we say that personality traits are adaptations?
Yeah, so this is what the theoretical models in behavioral ecology that ask questions about the evolution of personality are all about, right? They are asking these questions like, given these ecological conditions, can we understand why individuals become repeatably different in their behavior?
Yeah.
And so I'll give you the answer first about these models, right? And then about what we know about the data. Right, it's more daunting, as always, right? And one of the earlier ideas was that that if individuals differ in a state variable, and I'll explain in a minute what the state variable then is, right? Then there would also be selection for them to differ in their behavior. So state variable is a trait basically that individuals possess that affects the balance of the costs and benefits of behavioral actions, right? So, for example, if you have a nice body armor, right? Selection might favor you to be more bold, and because then you can forage also in the open and get more food without actually being eaten because you're protected by the body armor, right? And so those were the early models that said, well, actually, right, if individuals differ in some state variable, then we're actually expecting also animal personality differences to evolve, right? And that you could call adaptive. Now, the problem is, of course, where do these state differences come from? Why are those then here? Right? And then one of the ideas was, well, maybe those are just stochastic, right? There's some stochastic variation that leads individuals to be on different trajectories. And this stochastic variation might then also cause the differences in behavior. Now, that's, of course, a problem too, because what you could expect is then what's called a negative feedback loop. Right. So, for example, if you're in a bad condition, you might go out and forage a lot, but this might actually restore your condition, and therefore you're not going out to forage. Right. So these negative feedback loops, they would actually erode the initial differences in the state and the behavior, and that has been the big criticism then to those models. And then people said, okay, then we should come up with a different explanation. Maybe there are positive feedback loops. And a nice example of a positive feedback loop is this idea of skill. So if you're doing a particular task that might benefit your fitness, the next time you do it, you might do it a little bit better. Or you might say, to perform a particular task, you need some sort of sensory system, right? You need to build, so sort of a sensory system that allows you to do this, right? So you need to make this initial investment to be able to show a particular type of behavior. Once you've built this system, you can reuse it. Right. So the idea then is that if you have different behavioral options, once you have actually invested in maybe arbitrarily choosing this option, next time when you are asked the question, are you going to do this or that, you're going to do the same thing again, because that now has become more profitable to do. Right. And so then the idea is that these positive feedback loops, they actually lead to individuals becoming different over time. And that was sort of the final class of models actually that talked about this notion that we cannot rely on differences in state to understand differences in personality, because we are just removing the problem, right, to another level. We're saying, these differences in behavior, they come because individuals differ in something else. So that's not a very nice explanation. But this idea of these positive feedback loops, that is actually much more interesting. And this is something that that people have been trying to test actually. Problem being, in this type of area, there's lots of theory actually about, but mostly what behavior ecologists do, and maybe some colleagues of me who will listen to this will greatly be upset or disagree. Most behavior ecologists nowadays are not actually testing theory at all. They're just describing the phenomena. So we have quite a few theoretical models predicting when personality should or should not evolve. And they come up with predictions and clear assumptions. But then, bloody hell, very few people, actually empiricists like me, actually try to then test the predictions of these hypotheses. So we then know still relatively little on whether animal personality is, in that sense, an adaptation.
I mean, talking about social species, there are species where different individuals fulfill different roles or have different roles in their societies, let's say. Does that also influence the personality traits that those individuals have? I mean, I guess that it could go in two different directions. I mean, one of them would be that different individuals already have from the outset different personality traits, and then based on those personality traits they fulfill different roles, or by being given a particular role, then, I mean, due to behavioral plasticity, let's say, they would develop different personality traits to fulfill that role. Does this make sense?
Yeah, so there is actually a lot of work on this that has been developed over the past 5 years or so, and particularly work on eusocial insects, but also on, for example, say birds with parental care, right, where you have a, say, two-partner system, right, also a little social hub. And if you think about social insects, like ants, for example, they have this division of labor, right? So you have different individuals performing different tasks. And traditionally, people always thought that this is related just to age and morphology somehow. That explains this variation. And now we actually know that there's a lot of unexplained variation, that basically individuals are different in what tasks they perform, right? Whether they go out in forests or whether they protect a nest, for example, or take care of the offspring, right, in an ant colony, you can imagine. But now we know that this is not enough, actually, that individuals are, even if you control for the differences in age and morphology, there are unexplained differences, right? And there's a lot of work that has been focusing on the question of whether animals that play the role, right, of, for example, defending the nest, right, whether those are also more aggressive on other tasks, right? And that seems to be the case, actually. And there has been quite a bit of work now also where people have been quantifying using these standardized personality tests, like these novel environment tests, these types of tests, right? To first quantify this variation and then ask whether the variation in personality is actually predicting the productivity of the colony. And what we are lacking a bit, but there are actually quite there are some examples where people have also created these colonies themselves, you could say, right? So made combinations of basically animals where there's a lot of variation in the types or whether everyone has a similar type. And then asked again, right, does that affect the productivity? And that seems to be the case. So that I think that answers your question, that essentially we think that if you have more variation in these sort of innate behavioral differences, this causes partly, you could say, or correlates with the variation in the tasks, right, that leads to this division of labor, and there is selection maintaining it, right? So a more diverse end society actually does better. Now, there is then also a lot of debate, again, about this issue, like, okay, where does this come from? And there's actually a recent target paper in behavioral ecology that is talking about exactly this this subject. So that paper is coming out very soon, and many of us, including me, have been writing a commentary on that. That's a very nice way to communicate, right, about something new in science, right, in behavioral ecology. Target article with like 10 or 20 commentaries, and the idea that the authors postulate there is that you actually again have these positive feedback loops. That there are some differences in behavior in terms of how you relate to conspecifics, for example, that make you a bit more aggressive or a bit less aggressive. And therefore you're more likely to perform a certain task, and that feeds back in a way that you then become a soldier, for example, versus a worker who goes out and forages for the offspring.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to add to that, there's also increasing interest in systems that are, for example, having biparental care, right? In birds, for example, right? Where you have this sort of matching personalities, right? Whether there's actually selection for the male and the female to be similar, so that they can be very coordinated, or to be very different in their behavior. And this is sort of ongoing work. And there's now, for example, in the next months or so, there's going to be a special issue of a Journal of Evolutionary Biology on this issue of like, is there actually a sortative mating, right? So those are really questions, these questions about the social environment, that are now at the forefront of people working on personality and behavioral ecology.
Talking about the eusocial animals that you mentioned, let's say, like, for example, ants and some bees, because they are all the ones that are part of the same colony are all genetically related, or at least tend to be. So could it be the case that, for example, the ant queen or the bee queen is prepared to produce a certain number of individuals to fulfill a particular role, and then when the colony doesn't need more of those individuals, it would shift for another type of individual with a different with a different genome, let's say, to fulfill a different role? I mean, could that happen? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, I don't know so much about that actually, but I can imagine that through these maternal effects,
Yeah.
the mothers, right, the queen in this case, can actually shape the
Yeah.
offspring phenotype, and for sure that is the case. There are some nice examples also in mammalian societies, right? So, for example, there is quite a bit of work that focuses on the position that the embryos have in the uterus of the female mouse, and
Yeah.
how that is affecting later behavior. And that has partly to do with the amount of testosterone that these fetuses are then being provided through the bloodstream of the female. And that is you could also see that as a manipulation, right? That females could thereby ensure, right, if that is adaptive, if that's an adaptive maternal effect, ensure that there is diversity among offspring in the phenotypes that emerge after birth.
Yeah, so my last question will be, in terms of the ecological aspects that individuals respond to, do we know what are the ones that lead to individual variation? For example, in your work, I read about perceived predation levels, resource availability, trade-offs between current and future reproduction. So could you tell us about that, and maybe what are other factors that we know about?
So by and large, right, we think that this variation, right, has to do with, as for many traits, right,
Mhm,
predators, foods, conspecifics,
mhm,
and maybe parasites, right? And the variation in these biological factors is shaping probably the variation in these traits, right?
mhm,
Affecting both the mean level that is evolved in the population, right? So the adaptive peak in the population, as well as the variance. I'm thinking about an example. Yeah, so one idea that has been proposed in the literature relatively recently is that there are internal mechanisms in the population that that create variation in environmental conditions,
mhm,
and thereby offer a very general explanation that's applicable to any population of a species. That would be nice, right? If we have a
mhm,
single type of explanation. Because we, if it would always have to hinge on, say, is there variation in predation pressure, or is there variation in parasites or food availability? That might not always be the case, right? And so, is there a general explanation? And one of the ideas is that what characterizes every single population is that there are a bunch of individuals that are interacting, right? At
mhm,
worst, you have to mate with another individual, right? But you're also
mhm,
competing for resources. So, and what we see, right, is that populations vary a lot of size because there's population regulation, right? The populations increase, and then at some point they also there is negative density dependence uh, coming into the population because there's too little resources for the individuals available, and then the population might even crash, and so populations often go up and down, right? Varies a lot between species, right? We know all the examples of the voles, for example, that have these great increases and then these crashes, right? And crickets do also do that. In gradients, for example, these population changes are a bit more subtle. But one of the ideas is that individuals that live under conditions where there's very little competition,
mhm,
they are actually selected for a very different life history than individuals that live in conditions where there is a lot of competition. So the idea is that when there's little competition, selection would favor animals that actually favor population growth, right? And so
mhm,
that means animals that might actually live fast and die young. They might produce a lot of offspring because the more offspring they produce early in life, the more they contribute actually, right, in terms of the
mhm,
gene pool to the population. So there's selection favoring animals that have these types of strategies, the aggressive, bold types of animals potentially that acquire resources so that they can produce a lot of offspring quickly, but maybe at the cost, right, of not living very fast. And this might then lead to a population increase. Only works well if there's relatively little competition. But then when there's a lot of competition for resources, when the population size is near carrying capacity, uh, then that strategy might not actually work. And then there might be actually selection for individuals that are more conservative, right? That actually creates, or that builds, you could say, soma, a body, right? That is be able to withstand competition, and that also cleverly, right, do not produce all the offspring at one time, but maybe have a delayed reproduction and smaller clutches, right? So they live slow, right? So fast versus slow types of lifestyles. And so that is one of the ideas, that we have this integration with the pace of life and personality, so that the types differ in their pace of life,
mhm.
that some are bold and live fast and die young compared to others, and that this has very much to do with the competition that individuals are experiencing within the population. And one of the ideas is then that if you have these cycles, these changes in population density, that this could actually partly help us understand why the variation is also explained, why the variation in personality is then maintained.
Yeah.
This is a very active area of research where we don't have many definite answers, I should say. So these ideas have been published just very recently, and now people are starting to put these ideas to the test.
Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Dingemanse, let's end the interview here. Just before we go, where can people find your work on the internet?
Oh, where they can find my work on the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a website at the LMU, which is not very detailed. It just lists our paper. People can also go to my Google Scholar site. This is where I'm listing all the papers that come out of the group. I'm relatively active on Twitter also, Dingemanse Lab. So if you're interested in following what's coming out of our group, even before the publication is there, I often tweet about that too.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Dingemanse, thank you a lot again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was really fun to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. I enjoyed it a lot.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to consider making a pledge on Patreon. I have the link in the description box, or on PayPal. You can also find the links there. And otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters on PayPal: Karen Litzke and Blanchett, Paroga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunde, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormer, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hughney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Staten T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Ethan Solon, Romain Roch, Dmitry Grigoriev, and Diego Londoño Correa. My producers, Isar Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luis Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran. And my executive producers, Michal Rojewski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.